196th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, sustainable agriculture, local food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of the recent buzz around soil health and farming is that it makes one thing crystal clear. We can turn back the clock to a time when the world beneath our feet was more in sync with the natural ecosystems. An increasing number of farmers are utilizing cover cropping, diverse rotations, managed rotational grazing of livestock, and no-till production to rebuild the biological life soils need to become as self-sufficient as they once were. The result is less erosion, a reduced reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and a better ability to manage precipitation. That latter benefit is particularly key as a changing climate produces an increasing number of extreme rainfall events that often overwhelm traditional conservation measures. Roy Beyer is one of those farmers proving that the soil can be brought back to life, even after it's been exposed to severe damage. In 2008, torrential rains hammered his family's farm in southeastern Minnesota, washing away soil to such an extent that Beyer was worried he literally would eventually not have enough topsoil left to grow crops on. This launched him on a bit of a campaign to build his soil's biology. Today, Beyer produces certified organic milk as well as beef, corn, soybeans, and small grains, utilizing cover cropping, managed rotational grazing, diverse rotations, and soil amendments. This multifaceted approach is paying off. Beyer says one of his fields started out with an organic matter level of around 1.7% 7 years ago. Today, it's at 4.4%. Such a jump is key to improving soil health, since organic matter is at the heart of developing functional, biologically active soils. Beyer's family recently hosted a Land Stewardship Project field day on soil health, and the improvements he's made to his fields and pastures were evident. Just that week, intense rainstorms have moved massive amounts of eroded soil in a neighboring cornfield. But the Beyer's land had soaked up the rainfall, leaving the soil intact and storing the moisture in the long term, so crops and forages could make use of it later in the summer. After the field day, Beyer explained to me what prompted him to rebuild his soil's biological life, and what steps he's taken to do just that. But before we talked, I had a conversation with Justin Morris, who led a pasture walk at the field day and who is a regional soil health specialist for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Morris laid out for me the 5 principles of soil health, and why livestock in particular are the rock stars of bringing life back to the land. Justin, you had really laid out nicely kind of the basic principles of soil health. We're here at a field day at the Rory Beyer farm, and he had showed us some of the things that he'd been doing. Kind of laid out those 5 principles. Can you lay those out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first principle that we mentioned earlier today was minimizing disturbance. So that's looking at disturbances that come either from the result of tillage. It can also come through the result of the misapplication or over-application of a lot of the chemicals that we apply on the land, and also the over-application of manures. So if we over-apply any of those, that can be in itself a disturbance, because the soil biology has to be able to mediate and work with all this stuff, and especially when we're working with a degraded field, a degraded system that doesn't have very good soil health. It's actually in a state of fairly poor health. There's not a lot of workers in there to do the job of metabolizing all of this stuff. So that's where we have to be really careful with the disturbances that we use on the landscape. Then when we move into the second principle, that's really trying to keep that soil covered as much as possible. Just like we do best when, obviously when you've got a good winter coat on to be able to mediate the temperature effects when you go out into the wintertime. The soil also needs to have a coat on itself as well, basically an insulative blanket. And so having that either in dead plant residue in the form of mulch or a living plant that's going to provide that benefit of keeping the soil covered, that's going to give us Number one, it's going to protect that soil from erosion, and it's also going to help moderate soil temperature effects, which are so critical for the soil biology to function the way that they need to. Then we move on to the third principle, which is really maximizing biodiversity. And so what we're really looking at there is trying to maximize or increase the number of crop types that we're growing. So say, for instance, if we are on a corn and soybean farm, corn is a warm season grass, soybean is a legume, but it does very well in warmer temperatures, kind of behaves like a warm season. And what we should be looking at is in natural ecosystems, you usually have not just a warm season grass or a warmer, a broadleaf or legume that does well in warmer temperatures, but you also have cool season grasses and also broadleafs that do better in cooler temperatures. And so really our farming systems should mimic as much as possible the complexity or the biological diversity to a degree of what the natural systems have. So if I have corn and soybeans in my rotation, maybe I should look at introducing perennial pasture as like a cool season grass that is going to be very diverse in species and actually provide a different type of carbon release through the root system than what the corn and the soybeans do. So different plants exude a different signature, different array, combination of carbohydrates through their root system. And then what we may run in also in rotation with that perennial pasture is we may put in more of a cool season legume like an alfalfa or something like that. Or we may look at another cool season grass. It'd be maybe like a small grain of some kind. So it's really looking at having a both cool and warm season of both grasses and legumes, basically the four functional groups, and trying to mimic that in our cropping landscape as much as possible, because we need to take how nature functions and try to mimic that as much as possible, because then that can really help to take out the high cost, in a lot of what we would call, standard farming practices. And then we'll move into the fourth principle, which is really looking at having a living root in that soil 24/7, 365, because we've learned that a living plant exudes or releases anywhere from 10 to 40% of the carbohydrates that it photosynthesizes. To me, that was a revelation when I learned that, because it's like, wow, I didn't realize that roots were more than just the site of absorption. That's what I've always thought they were, but it's actually a site of two-way exchange. The plant is absorbing mineral nutrients from the soil, and working in tandem with the soil biology, but the plant is also releasing out to that soil biology carbohydrates, because of soil biology, the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, the earthworms, they can't make their own food. They can't make their own carbohydrates. Plants do that. So plants are the interface between capturing solar energy and getting that into the soil biology. That it has to all pass through a plant in order for that to take place.
I think that's a really great point. It explains why more of the field days I'm going to, they're digging soil pits to show the root structure.
Yes.
Because before it'd be like, well, how's this cornfield looking, or how are the beans looking, or even the small grains? But it's really, it's that hidden part of it sounds like it's so key.
Exactly. So what's going on below ground is extremely important to what we see going on above ground. So when we delve into this fourth principle of having a live root, we, in the ground 365 days out of the year, we're really looking at, okay, when our cash crop is harvested, do we have a window of opportunity where we still have some growth in the fall that we could have a cover crop planted in that fall time period? Say, for instance, if I'm coming off of corn silage. Corn silage is usually coming off early September or somewhere in that region. We still have some growing degree days left that we could plant a cover crop in there. And there's different ways of getting cover crops into either right after the cash crop comes off, or interseeding or overseeding into the cash crop, so that we have a cover We have green plant material that is photosynthesizing and continuing to feed the soil biology in the fall. And then, if it's a cover crop that won't winter kill, it'll overwinter, then it'll start continuing to grow in the spring and continue to feed the soil biology. As we feed the soil biology, we're feeding the mycorrhizal fungi and the other soil biology that is going to help make those glues, that's going to help the soil particles to start adhering together to make stable aggregates, because aggregate stability is so critical to getting good water infiltration and water holding capacity. Now we're going for number 5, which is really integrating the livestock using what has been called adaptively managed high stock density grazing. And so that's really looking at not just putting animals out on the cropland or just kicking them out to the pasture to just continuous graze, but to actually move the animals in a sequence using daily moves in a way that mimics the grazing patterns that the bison implemented. And producers who are doing that and who are moving the animals in the system, they are moving the animals in a way that the animals are packed fairly tight together, so that the manure and the urine, the saliva, the milk foam is being deposited on the landscape. They're grazing these pastures usually at a more mature stage, and plants that are more mature are higher in carbon. They're more lignified, and so they'll allow the animals to eat maybe a third of that plant material and tread down the rest of it. And about a third of that plant residue that's treaded down to the soil surface will actually get incorporated into the soil. That is a tremendous, tremendous healing effect for the soil when producers start integrating livestock being managed in a grazing situation to that level. Now, people can still continue to, if they want to, they may look at, okay, moving animals every single day, that would be a huge chore. But every producer that I know of that has tried that generally, never goes back to doing grazing in a, a more relaxed fashion. They will use the adaptively managed high density grazing for 3-4 months out of the year. Go back to maybe a little bit more relaxed rotation throughout the remainder of the year, but they are going to implement that facet of what nature did with the bison and with other wild herbivores from around the planet to really use the animals as a tool to lay down carbon on the soil surface to be able to feed that soil with trampled plant residues.
And you had mentioned earlier, I think when we were out in the pasture here doing some soil infiltration tests, there's really no replacement for that animal impact. Like, there's maybe people have tried to use different equipment or different regimes, but it really sounds like there's no replacement for that.
Exactly. And that's where, people oftentimes chuckle a little bit when I say, when we hear the nursery rhyme, Old MacDonald had a farm, it's really not too far from the truth, because on Old MacDonald's farm, he had animals as a part of that farming system. And not only did he have one animal, but he had several different species. What a revelation. If we go back to our grandparents' and great-grandparents' time, virtually all farms had livestock to some degree or another. They had chickens, they had pigs, they had cows, they might have had some sheep in there, maybe some horses. But every farm and livestock were a central component of the farming system. And really, by talking about this, this livestock integration with the adaptively high-density grazing management system, we're really looking at trying to plug the animals back onto the cropland and also to encourage that style of management on perennial pastures so that we can really start to rebuild the soils, because while we can take soil health to a fairly high level without ruminant animals on top of the ground, anybody who, once they incorporate ruminant animals into the system using that type of adaptive high stock density grazing management, they've been able to take their soil health to a much higher level as a result of that. And that's really showing that, you know what, animals were supposed to be part of the system in the first place.
Right.
That's part of the natural ecology of the land in which we live in, because our soils, in large part, and most of the central U.S., across the Great Plains and much of the Midwest, were built with herbivores grazing tall grasses. And again, we're going back to that natural pattern of what did nature do? How were these soils, how were the deep, rich prairie soils built and maintained in the first place? Well, it was using herbivores, grazing tall stature grasses in very much in a bunched fashion, and that's how nature did it.
You're somebody who gets out, I assume, a fair bit and sees farmland in the Midwest and that type of thing. The field days I'm attending and the workshops and the farmers I'm talking to are kind of expressing a general, I guess, frustration or a little bit of sadness, I guess is another word, over the fact that it seemed like we made a lot of advances, say, starting in the 70s up into the 80s and the 90s in controlling soil erosion and controlling that movement, and that there was a lot of advances in no-till and that type of thing. And maybe that's explaining a little bit the interest in soil health these days, that there's a little concern that maybe we went a little bit backwards, that they're seeing more, like I said, soil moving off of fields that where it shouldn't be moving. Maybe it's relatively flat or whatever. I mean, is that something you're seeing, that there is maybe a little bit of, we made these great advances basically since the Dust Bowl and then in the 70s when no-till came around, but now that we're kind of, I don't know, plateauing, but or maybe even kind of going backwards a little bit?
Yeah, I've seen data that talks about, in fact, I was just at a field day last week. A presenter showed for Wisconsin the average amount of soil loss through the decades. And we were doing pretty good. We're steadily, being able to keep our soil erosion to a minimum till about the early 90s, and now we're losing more than we have up until the early 90s. Probably part of the explanation with that, and I don't think there's probably any one single component to it or not, but a lot of folks who tried no-till in the 70s or 80s, a lot of them didn't incorporate cover crops at the time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've seen is people who try something, usually the first 2 or 3 years, especially with no-till, you kind of see yield drop, and then after about the third year, then if they stick with it, then oftentimes they start to see a little bit of an increase. And if you're going to do any of these, what I would call soil health promoting practices of no-till and cover crops and grazing, you really need to be using all three of them as much as you possibly can. I think what we're starting to see with the renaissance in soil biology, this rebirth of learning in soil health, is that farmers are realizing, you know what, it's a multifaceted approach. I got to use more than just one thing to improve things. Yes, no-till might be a good starting point, but I need to start integrating cover crops into the system and increasing the diversity of the crops in my rotation. The other thing, too, is there's been probably over the years, as far as commodity prices and what farmers have felt like that they need to grow, is there's been a proliferation just within the last 2 decades of the number of acres that's in corn and soybeans. And both of those crops leave the soil bare or very much unprotected for a good chunk of time during the spring when we are getting a lot of precipitation and heavy rainfall events. And because of the proliferation of acres in those 2 crops, I think that's could be a contributing factor to why we've seen in the last 2 decades kind of more soil erosion occurring. I would say that'd be my best outlook on that, on why that's occurring. But the wonderful thing about this, the message with soil health, is that no matter what state your farm is in, I don't care if it's the most badly eroded farm in the United States, there is a way to get it back. And it doesn't require a lot of expensive inputs to be able to make that happen. It requires following those principles like what we talked about, that if you stay true to the principles, you can design a system that will work in virtually any environment. And how you use that system, how you use those principles may be different than your neighbor 10 miles down the road, because your soils may be different, your topography may be different, the type of crops that you're using may be a little bit different. But if you understand the principles, then then you can design your own system that's going to help to improve it.
Roy, we had a great field day here. We talked a little bit about some of the things that you've been doing to improve soil health. But you had talked at the beginning of the field day, you had really started it off by talking about what got you, I guess what opened your eyes or got you said almost kind of on a campaign to improve your soil health. And that was some things you were seeing that you weren't really happy with some of the things going on in some of the fields. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
The things that we were looking at from the start was in 2008, a flood ran through this area, and it was a devastating flood. Some people call it a 500-year flood. Some people call it a 1,000-year flood. But anyway, we got 17 inches of rain dumped on us in under 24 hours. So there was massive washing of the soil and problems with that. And so at that point, we began to wonder, well, we've got to keep some cover on this ground to keep it there, because if we have an event like this again, we won't have any topsoil left to put crops in. So then this past spring here, we had 6 inches in a day's time, and the washing was devastating. But luckily, we had implemented this over the last 5-6 years, and we began to see that the soil was starting to hold better, and biological life was coming back, both plants, animals, and in the soil. And so that's really what got us going on this whole thing. What we've been doing on our farm is we've been adding cover crops, and we've been foliar feeding our plants for about the last 5 or 6 years. And we foliar feed at least twice a year, and we add the mycorrhizal fungi, and we add some of the other like the liquid fish and some of the things that can really benefit the soil health. And so we consider it feeding the livestock below the soil, and in return it's beginning to show up in the plants out in the field, and also in the cows when they come in. They come in out of the pastures, they're healthier, they have less mastitis, the dairy cows do, they perform better, and we really, actually, I don't think we even have a vet bill anymore, believe it or not. And prior to that, when we were conventional, we'd have vet bills as high as $30,000 a year, just trying to figure out what's wrong with our cows. And amazing how nature just kind of fixes everything.
Yeah, and so talk a little, you said it's not just the cows, but you're seeing it on the land itself, in the fields. What kind of things are you really noticing?
Well, the land, especially when we started with the one field day, or with the one field that was out here at the event that we were focusing on, we started with an organic matter of around 1.7%, and we've increased that organic matter percentage up to 4.4%, which is pretty astronomical to move that amount in that amount of years.
Yeah, like 7 years, you said?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, that's... and I think it's really to do with more so the microbiology in combination with the cover crops that's getting us to that point.
And that's significant, because basic soil science for years said you cannot really in a person's typical lifetime improve soil organic matter. But you're really proving, farms like you are proving you can.
Well, one point that was made during the field day here was that most of the research, and if I'm not mistaken, is done at the land-grant universities, and a lot of it is funded by large corporations. But at the same time, you start to begin to look at where it's done, and if it's done at these universities where the soil life has not necessarily always been alive, it makes a person wonder if it is in fact the soil rebuilding from the soil life and not anything else really.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Has it become even more of a priority to try to build soil health in that, I don't know how long you've been farming, but it does seem like we're seeing a situation where the climate we're getting these more intense storms, and it is maybe some methods that would have worked fine in years past and kept that soil in place aren't working anymore? Do you feel like you kind of have to step up your game a little bit, I guess?
I do feel like that. I feel like we really have to decide that perhaps the cost of putting in cover crops might hold more value from the perspective of holding the ground where it is, because as soon as that ground washes away, due to these climate events that are out of control, you can't get that ground back, and to build that topsoil is not a very slow process.
That is a 100-year, 200-year kind of thing. That's
Exactly.
not just, yeah. What's been kind of some of the challenges you've had in? I know cover crops can be, the timing is key for getting the cover crops in, but maybe take me a little bit through, when you say cover crops, what kind of a mix are you putting in, and when are you planting them, that kind of thing?
Lots of times what we try to do is we try to put a cover crop after a small grain. So, and the small grain works in our program because we use the small grain in lieu of using another product such as corn. So we'll sell corn and make the profit from selling the corn as a grain, and then turn around and use the cover crop, use the small grain to feed our cattle with, thus diversifying the amino acid profile in the ration, and also reducing our need to have so much monoculture.
So that must open a big window, because that's a big issue, is people harvesting corn, say, in October. They just don't have the time to get in the cover crop. So you're taking off what is it, or what's the small grains you're doing?
It's usually oats or barley.
So you're taking off oats and barley, I don't know what time of year, but that must give you a big window.
Yep. Usually about the end of July, beginning of August. So right about this time, we're getting ready to start swathing oats and barley. And after we take that off, then we'll either put in, depending upon what the field history is, we'll put in either a mix of like a tillage radish. If it's going into corn or something, we'll put in tillage radish along with like hairy vetch. Or if we're going to use it as a forage cover crop, we'll put in winter rye, because we found that winter rye does very well when we use it with our beef.
Well, you've really, because that's a big barrier for a lot of farmers, is they see the soil erosion, soil conservation benefits of the cover crop, but they have a hard time justifying it because maybe they don't have livestock, or they're not able to integrate it into their livestock. But you've got that end of it. I mean, you're able to add value to that through using it as a forage.
Absolutely. And I would say to the people that only run corn and beans and things like that, I would say there is room to diversify and, throw up a building and put some cattle out there. You'll be surprised what happens.
Or maybe borrow your neighbor's cattle.
There you go. Yeah, rent cattle. I mean, I've heard that's happened before too. So,
But I know you've been going to some field days, and you're really doing your research on this. But is there some things that you're looking at? There's like, okay, here's the next step or the next barrier I'd like to get over to really kind of push this a little bit further. Some things you've been thinking about?
I think the easiest and the quickest way to start moving in the right direction is to put in the cover crops, add some carbon to the ground, and get your soils in line and balanced first. And that'll take care of some of the biggest weed issues, especially from the perspective of an organic farm. And that's what our biggest challenge is right now, is trying to get those weeds under control. Once we've got that locked in, then we should be in a lot better situation. I think that is the first piece of the puzzle that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think one of the things, Justin Morris, who is here from the NRCS, was talking about this idea of eventually getting that soil to be self-perpetuating or self-reliant kind of thing. Is that kind of your goal?
Absolutely. I mean, if we can go out there and plant a crop and turn around and not need to add any additional fertilizer, and that's an extreme condition, but, even half the amount of fertilizer, even on the conventional side, we got to start putting dollars in the back of the pockets of the farmers so they can survive and pass this information on for the next generation.
For more on the Land Stewardship Project's work helping farmers build healthy, resilient soils, see www.landstewardshipproject.org. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-722-6377. Thanks to Laura Morgendale, Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, Visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.